Okay, so one of the subtests we had is recall of sequential order, and that's in the working memory composite, and it measures short-term memory and working memory. And this has to do with um, different verbal skills and retaining stuff, and then it has to do with visualization. So it starts off with some cards where you're establishing whether the student knows the difference between highest and lowest. And then it goes on to body parts where they have to say in sequential order. So if you get like head and foot, they're going to say, or foot head, then you get head and foot, and you show them this. And they can reference this until number 13. And for scoring purposes, you're going to start, you do the samples and the highest to lowest, and then you start with the first question in the block. And if they get the question right in that block, you go on to the next. You don't have to do the other ones. And then if the student, like say if the student got it wrong, then you'd go up to establish basal, and basal would be getting more than one right. And then you go back to where they got it wrong and do the next one to establish ceiling, and then ceiling would be less, one or less right in that section. And then we go on to another section, which is basically saying the same thing, sequential order, but there's also a non-body part word, and you administer all of them. There's no block rules on just doing the top one. So the basal is always going to be getting more than one right, and then here the student got all zeros, so that's a ceiling because you have to get one or less right in a block to get.
So the second subtest that we were assigned is called the recall of digits backwards. And this is also in the working memory composite. And this measures short-term memory and also working memory. So for this particular subtest, the examinee is given a set of numbers and is asked to repeat them backwards. So it's a lot of verbal information being retained and then being able to recall that information verbally again. So for the examiner, the scoring procedures are very important. There are blocks of 5 questions in each block. So one block, 5 questions. And as the examiner gives the test, they're starting with, of course, the sample, but then the first item, if they get that correct, then they move on to the first item of the second block. And if they get that first item in the second block right, we continue on to the next block. And if, say you get one, the first item of whatever block you're on, they get it wrong, then you're gonna backtrack, to the last block where you how do you explain that, bro? So the second subtest that we were assigned is called recall of digits backwards, and this is also in the working memory composite. And what this does is it measures short-term memory and also working memory. So in the subtest, the examiner gives the examinee a set of numbers verbally, and the examinee is asked to repeat them verbally backwards. So after administering the sample item, there are blocks of questions, and each block contains 5 different questions. And how the examiner goes about doing this is they administer the first item of every block, and if they pass the first item in that block, then they get to go on to the next block. And so you would read the first item of that second block, and if they get that correct, you move on to the first item of the third block, right? But say you get the first item in whatever block wrong, you're going to backtrack to the last block and continue administering where you left off to establish your basal. So that is getting more than one correct would be establishing your basal. So after administering all the items in that block, and if they obtain the basal, then you would continue on to where you last left off and establish your ceiling. So that would be getting only one correct or fewer right than one. And then at that point, you would stop administering the exam. Another thing to note is if the examinee gets all of the first items right in each block until they hit item 26, you're just going to finish off reading the remaining items in that last block. And then after that, you would just calculate the ability score, and the table for that conversion is right here. It's provided. Um, and